I want to play a game. This is the No Fear podcast. We know what scares you. I'm Matt.
And I'm Lisa. And this is the No Fear Cast, the podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. This is episode 16 of season 8, and we're starting a new series that we are calling Fun and Games. So you probably know the intro that Matt read. I want to play the game, of course, is the catchphrase made famous by Jigsaw in the Saw franchise movies. And this new series that I'm really excited that we're kind of kicking off today is all about these kind of games that people play in horror movies and what makes it scary. We're going to talk a little bit about the history of the subgenre today and just kind of get into some of our favorites. So I'm not going to give a comprehensive history of this kind of subgenre, but I am going to point out a few important, I think, we'll call them milestones maybe along the way in this. I'm really honestly not sure how far it goes back. My first thought was that it probably dates back to The Most Dangerous Game, which has been remade several times in different forms. There's been films, um there's been a lot, just to name a few of some of these. And when I say a lot, I'm talking about, I don't know, maybe 20, 30 remakes of different names. So, of course, there's The Most Dangerous Game, the 1932, which was the first kind of major film adaptation of it. There was one that Robert Wise, who is a favorite director of this podcast, did called A Game of Death, which involves a Nazi and is set in the aftermath of World War II. But there's lots of different ones. One of the most recent ones was The Hunt, which was a Craig Zobel directed film that looks at these, it takes like political lines that people are following, these kind of liberal elitists who bring in deplorables, they call them, to hunt and kill. And then, of course, there was a remake of the original one called The Most Dangerous Game that came out just a couple of years ago. But this originated as a short story. It was first published in Collier's magazine in 1924. So you're talking about this subgenre at least goes back a century, if not longer. And it was written by Richard Connell. And it's basically the story of a big game hunter who falls out of a boat and swims to this seemingly abandoned island in the Caribbean, where he is then hunted down by a very wealthy man who I believe is of Russian persuasion. But it's this idea that people in all of the remakes, I guess, it's this idea that you have somebody who is super wealthy and has turned hunting humans, hunting people into a game. And that's basically the gist of it. And we'll probably talk about a few kind of iterations of that, because I think that's one of the most common forms of this like fun and game horror, that's what we're gonna call, I guess, this subgenre. But even thinking about it, like the Hostel movies that came out in the aughts, those certainly I think fit into this category too, because you have this like really wealthy elite who are taking American teens and Americans in their 20s who are traveling through these hostels and basically paying to torture them and kill them. So this goes back a lot. I will also point out too that this is one of those stories that is now in the public domain. So I imagine we'll continue to see more of the Most Dangerous Game adaptations coming out just because it is in the public domain. But a few more, like I said, standouts when it comes to the building of this genre, because this isn't a genre that really, I think, I think there are some similarities that these films share, but it's a pretty wide category. Like we're casting a pretty wide net when we talk about it. But of course, I want to mention a few. There's The House on Haunted Hill. Now, I'm particularly referring to the Vincent Price movie, but there was a remake. Not a, it wasn't an entirely bad remake either that I think came out in the 90s. I can't remember the exact date on that. But basically, the gist of this movie is Vincent Price plays a very wealthy man who is hosting a dinner party in honor of his wife, who he openly despises. And they have this contentious relationship, this like rivalry going on. And he tells everybody that if they can stay in this haunted house overnight, they'll win money. So there's this idea of playing a game in order, usually it's to get money. This genre has a lot, by the way, of like haves versus have nots. That's pretty much kind of a benchmark. Not always, but a lot of it is. So that's a pretty fun one. Then there are the particular brands of movies where there's an actual game being played. So not like a made up one by a wealthy person, but an actual like board game or something like that being played. Of course, one of the most notable ones, at least for me, that came up was The Exorcist. If you remember, uh, little baby Linda Blair she invites the demon, I guess, into her body when she talks to the Ouija board. And she gets the demon Pazuzu, but he's coming through, I think, as Captain Howdy. It's been a while since I've seen that movie, but I think that was the name of it. Um, so you have, an actual like game board becoming the portal into another dimension, which is another way that kind of fun and games find their way into horror. And similarly to Hellraiser, of course, that was based on The Hellbound Heart by Clive Barker, but it's most famously known, I think, as the 80s franchise of films. And in that case, you actually do have a puzzle box, and people go and seek these things out. So, like I said, we're casting a pretty wide net. There are some of these, as in the Most Dangerous Game, where the people don't necessarily know they're playing a game until they're already trapped in it. Or there are ones who actually go out and seek a game for whatever reason. Maybe they want money, or they want fame, or they want forbidden knowledge, as in the case of Hellraiser. And so they go and actually seek this out. Of course, I think a big, big trait of these is that people are always getting more than they bargained for when they play these games, whether they're forced to play or they go in willingly. There's always more uh, than meets the eye, I guess. That's kind of a common thread. So that was a very quick crash course in this kind of history of the subgenre horror fun and games. Matt, I want to open it up to you to get your initial thoughts on this genre, and perhaps you could tell me, why do you think this has been in horror for so long? I mean, like I mentioned, this has been a staple in this genre for at least a century. Probably goes back further. I just haven't finished digging back into the history that far. But um, why do you think we are attracted to this over and over again? And why do you think it's so scary?
I think those are excellent questions to start off after that, first of all, awesome historical overview. So thanks for providing that context. Um, I honestly think one of the big one of the big reasons why this is such a common trope and why we find it scary is the the loss of control that happens to the main characters in these games. Like you pointed out, in most instances they're either forced to play, or they're getting way more than they originally bargained for. as a result of playing the games. And in both of those instances, it's kind of this loss of control. And also, I mean, we think of games as fun. You know, I mean, I love playing video games. There's no consequences to them. If I die in the video game, I just restart. If you play a board game and you play Monopoly with your family, yes, you may have some tense moments, but at the end of the game's over. Everybody's still alive and probably still friends. I mean, you know, games are meant to be fun and not have extreme consequences to them. And I'm kind of rambling, but I'm trying to get to the point of I think that's one of the elements of horror there is that it's taking this thing that we normally do and have done for arguably millennia as a species. I mean, some of the oldest games go back hundreds of years, if not thousands of years. I mean, chess was, I don't know when chess was invented, but it's an ancient game. Same with the Chinese game Go, same with the African game Mancala. Anyway, we as a species love to play games, and we play them, I guess we could really dive into the reasons and psychology of why we'd play them, but I would argue that one of the main reasons is because they're fun, but they let us continue to like use our brains in different ways. And games and horror are flipping that on its head. It's kind of hard to have fun when you are literally running for your life. I mean, that's the stakes couldn't be higher there. It's adding an extra dimension of if you falter, if you lose, if you, in most cases, come in second, you're dead. And it's removing that fun, diversionary aspect and turning it into a literal fight for your life. That's pretty terrifying. And to circle back to that loss of control thing, like you said, most of these instances, like the most dangerous game or Hostel or House on Haunted Hill, these are all things that most of the participants are either forced into or the game starts with them as participants and they're not even aware of it until it's actually happening. And I mean that loss of control, that loss of consent, that you know I was signed up, press ganged into this game, fight for my life that I don't want to be part of. I don't want to be hunted for sport. I don't want to have to fight back. Um, I mean that's terrifying. The idea in a lot of those particular types is the person wakes up and they're playing the game essentially, and it's like that's that's a really scary thing. And then, of course, the more than you bargain for, I mean, the two examples that you use, The Exorcist and Hellraiser, like, of course, playing with a Ouija board, we can circle back and forth over how how dangerous that is in real life or not, but in movies, we know that's a conduit to demonic possession a lot of times, and that's a terrifying thing. Also fits into that loss of control. And then the Hellraiser puzzle box. I mean, you are. It's been a long time since I've seen the original movies, and I haven't seen most of them. Sequels, I think I stopped at three, but if I remember the first one, the person that was originally seeking the puzzle box was trying to get like power or knowledge, and instead unleashed these Cenobites onto the world. And I mean, and they are just these craven monstrosities that don't really care about anything but causing pain. So, I mean, I mean, what's more terrifying than that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're really kind of digging down into something when you talk about this like loss of control that comes with these games because we're used to games being an escape we're used to games being something fun. We associate them with recreation, with, it's time to stop work and and play something, which brings a lot of times we think about like games being a little bit childish. We associate them with children, but still adults play a lot of games. And I actually looked it up while you were talking because I was curious. I was like, "Ooh, when was the first board game?" And it when at least according to the New York Times, it dates back to um the ancient Babylonian game of is what it looked like it was called. But that goes back to something like 2500, 3000 BC. So you're talking about what, 5,000 years ago that, at least that we have on record that people have actually been sitting down to play some sort of recreational game. So I do think that it's such a part of our society and kind of what makes us human that we can sit down and like divide our time and say this is work time, but this is like time I'm gonna relax, but also like spend with my friends, that I'm gonna build a sense of community. So it is something that's so important, I think, to making us who we are. And so I think when you take that and you take something that you're like, oh, this is supposed to be a fun, safe space, and it turns into something sinister and something that we can't control anymore and something dangerous. I do think that really gets down to what makes us, honestly, now that I'm talking about it, I think it shares a lot, and I would not have made this comparison until we started talking about this, but I think it shares a lot with like home invasion um, narratives and stories, because that's also like an invasion of a space that's supposed to be like safe and relaxing, and it's a place that you only share with those who are like closest to you. So when that space is invaded, it feels even worse. It feels even more um of like more of a violent violation than I think it normally would if it happened in like if the attack happened in like a public space versus something in your own home. And I think this kind of like fun and games horror feels like that too, because it's something that we're not, it's such polar opposites to what we do when we play games. And I was also thinking about this too while you were talking, but games are supposed to be safe, right? But there's also, even as children, when we play games, there is an element of kind of tempting fate, I guess that's what I want to say, when we play some of these games, because like I brought up The Exorcist and the Ouija board. Most people, I think, look at Ouija boards and say, "Oh, that's just a board game that was made by a corporation to sell to sell a toy," right? I think most people look at that like it's the same, it's the equivalent of Monopoly. It's just a little bit more quote unquote spooky, right? It's like a Halloweenified Monopoly game, basically. But there are people who believe that Ouija boards actually do work and that you can talk to spirits through them and you can connect to the other side. And so when you play with a Ouija board, I think there's this idea of, ooh, what if? Like, what if it does actually work? In the same way that, like, a child might hear about Bloody Mary and then decide to go into the bathroom, shut the door, turn off all the lights, light one single candle, and look into the mirror and say Bloody Mary 3 times. You always think, oh, nothing's going to happen, but there's that little bit of possibility that it's like, what if something happens? Which always has been intriguing to me, because the what if there it's a pretty small chance that that what if is going to happen, but if it does, that's a pretty catastrophic thing to be happening, right? Like if I were to say Bloody Mary 3 times and Bloody Mary actually did come out of the mirror, I would not want to come confront her, right? I mean, that was the legend I heard growing up was if you say her name, she's gonna I think the story I heard was if you say her name 3 times, it has to be dark. The lights, of course, have to be off. You have to have one single candle. The door has to be shut. You have to say her name 3 times while looking in the mirror, and then she will appear and she will kill you, but first she's gonna scratch your eyes out, and then she's gonna kill you in a horrible way. Like, it sounded to me at, like, my 10-year-old self as a truly horrible way to die. But you know what? I did it. Like, I did that partially under peer pressure, but like at a sleepover, I would always go into the bathroom and say Bloody Mary. I was constantly like tempting that. It's the same way with like Candyman and those movies. You always think, well, why would somebody say Candyman's name if you know Candyman is going to come? Well, that's also part of human nature too. Like that what if? What if I just tempt fate a little bit? Like, what if I can use this Ouija board and actually talk to something on the other side? You know, it might be like the ghost of my grandmother, and that would be great, but it also might be like a terrifying demon who's going to wreak havoc on my life. But I'm going to try it anyway because I want to see what happens. So I think there's also that aspect of these kind of like funning games. I think too. Now talking about the kids, I think a lot about the movie Jumanji. Like that would fit into that. I know that's a kids movie, but when they start playing it, I mean, nothing about the Jumanji game seems normal. Like it shows up out of nowhere. The board, if I remember right, is like shaking and making noises. Like even as they start to play, the pieces are like moving on their own. So it's not even like a normal board game that these kids just picked up. It's like a very weird, strange thing, and they still decide to play. So there's also that aspect of it of like, we're going to do something that might be dangerous, that might be catastrophic, but we're going to do it anyway because that's also human nature.
You stole my Jumanji comment, like just wholesale stole.
Got there first.
But for real, no, I mean, I think Jumanji. I mean, yeah, it's a kids movie, and I haven't seen the sequels, the ones with The Rock and Kevin Hart, so I'm not going to speak to those, but I'm going to assume that there's some similarities. But Jumanji really does, in my mind, fit into this whole thing because, like you said, there's this element of tempting fate. And I remember watching that movie. I was old enough not to be like scared by it. I was in high school when it came out, and so I wasn't like a little kid or anything. But I remember watching it, and the idea of the kid who I can't remember the character's name, but who becomes Robin Williams in the present day, being sucked into the game board. I mean, that's pretty terrifying, even like just as an idea. Like you've misplayed, and now you get to live in this game jungle world until somebody rolls the dice in the exact right way, and that happens to be like decades, and he ages and grows up in that world. Like that's terrifying. And yeah, it's almost like the stakes are always higher than even the people that know what they are anticipate, if that makes sense. I guess that's another way of saying getting more what you bargained for. But I mean, thinking that you're playing a game and kind of tempting the fate and going, oh, look, the pieces are moving by themselves. This thing has been buried, and it's pounding drums, and that's weird. And okay, let's play this while nobody else is around because we don't want them to know that we have it or whatever. But then to find out, oh, now you get to be in the game world. until somebody else can free you with a dice roll. Like that's that's like a quite a jump from playing a game. And then, in the case of Jumanji, also bringing Jumanji's world into our world. I mean, it's the those none of those stakes seem to be what's there when they start playing, if that makes sense. um yeah, yeah, like I mean, I don't know what else to say. I'm kind of like rambling a little bit now, but the games turning out to be far, far more and much higher stakes than people really want. And but I do agree with you to kind of go back to what your original point was, because I feel like I'm all over the place today. But that idea of tempting fate, the sleepover, going to um play Bloody Mary, that sort of thing. I mean, that does come up as an element in most of these types of horror stories, at least the ones where the people are willing or semi-willing participants. There is this idea of knowing that things could be bad but still doing it anyway.
Yeah, I think that's going to be a big part of it. Especially, I mean, the motivation I think is going to differ. I think you don't always need much of motivation other than just curiosity or peer pressure, as in the case with I feel like something like Jumanji. I think as we look at some of the different ones that as we flesh out the series over the next few episodes, we'll see, like, a lot of times money, for instance, is a big driver in why people decide to do these games that they know are dangerous, or that they find out once they start playing are dangerous. But I will say, while we're on the Jumanji, before we move on from it, I do have a 10-year-old at home, so he is right at the age where, like, The Rock is about the coolest person he can imagine. So he has seen all of the Jumanji movies and he loves them. Now, I've seen them too, and honestly, I could not tell you much about what they were about. I don't remember them being particularly bad, but they didn't stick out to me in the way the original did. To me, they kind of they're just different. I'll say that, but he loves them. So I don't know. Maybe if you have a young person at home who is looking for that kind of thing, eh, the original Jumanji is much more, I think, gateway horror. It's like if you like that movie, because it is pretty scary in moments. It's a good kind of primer for introducing some young person to the horror genre. The newer ones are more, if I remember, kind of action adventure, and they're much funnier than I think the original. So it's still good, but I think they're just a little bit different in tone. If you're looking for a grown-up version of Jumanji and maybe you liked that movie as a kid, I'm going to suggest, I thought of this one. There's this movie that came out, oh, probably about almost 10 years ago, called Beyond the Gates, that stars Barbara Crampton. Of course, she's been a main staple of the genre for decades, and she's great. But essentially, Beyond the Gates is about this. If I remember right, there are these brothers, and their father had gone missing, so you can already kind of feel the Jumanji uh ness to it. But they go because he had an old video store, their father did, and so they're cleaning it out, maybe to get ready to sell it. I think, like, they're going to sell the property, and so they're there and they're cleaning it out, and they're going through all these VHSs. And as they're cleaning it out, they find this board game that is called Beyond the Gates, and it's one of those, I don't know if anybody remembers from like the 80s and 90s, but for like a hot second, there were these board games that had a VHS component to them. So you would like put in the VHS and play along with things on there. I remember one that we had that I think was like a movie guessing game that you played that way anyway. But there was this. They find this board game that has a VHS tape with it, and it's called Beyond the Gates. And basically, they're in the game, and it's one of these things that's like, I don't know. There's some occult stuff dabbled in it. I don't want to say too much because it is kind of a fun movie, I think. But anyway, it's kids. To me, it felt like a if Jumanji was a horror movie made for adults, and it kind of has that like throwback vibe to it. I highly recommend that one. Um, I don't. I don't know. I see it talked about some, but I don't see it talked about like a whole lot. So it's not really like a deep cut. I think it's pretty popular among people who like horror, but I don't know. It's kind of when you were talking about Jumanji, I was like, ooh, that's a good one. I don't know, Matt. Since I shared that recommendation, why don't we kind of talk about maybe some of our favorites in this subgenre, like our favorite fun and games horror movies? And we don't have to go in depth, but maybe just throw out a few recommendations for our listeners as we're jumping into this series.
Well, I'll have to say the first Hellraiser is definitely going to be a recommendation. I know I was spotty on its details because it's been a long time since I've seen it, but it is a great movie, and I mean, heck, anything by Clive Barker is going to be pretty good and weird and a great recommendation. I would even say I haven't really watched many from the Saw franchise. That's not something that appealed to me that much, but I know that that's going to be like right up the alley for most people. But I'm going to give a kind of off the wall recommendation and recommend the movie Cube. I know we've talked about it in a previous episode. Oh, I don't remember when that was, probably a couple of seasons ago, but it's kind of an independent movie from the 90s about I can't remember how many people, 6 or 7, wake up in this cube-shaped room, and it really is a literal puzzle because the turns out that the cube-shaped room leads into another cube-shaped room. It leads into another cube-shaped room, and all of them, well, some of them have very deadly uh, devices and consequences, and none of them know why they're there. None of them know each other. It's it's not even a like hunting for sport sort of thing so much as it is, I guess, a dispassion it feels like a dispassionate observer just watching to see if anyone is able to survive, because there's a little bit of math involved as to like which room is going to be trapped and which rooms are not, and which specific room out of the 100 so would lead to the exit. And so I loved that movie. I remember renting it with a friend of mine. We had heard nothing about it. We saw the cover while walking through the video store. We read the back and we're like, this sounds cool. And we watched it and we're like, that was really cool. So uh, I would definitely recommend Cube. Stay away from its sequels. They are not good, but the first one, absolutely recommended. And I mean, since it fits in, I mean, I have to throw in the original Exorcist as well, just because, I mean, it's The Exorcist. It's a classic.
Yeah, I will echo Cube as well because that is a fun one. And that one's really interesting because I feel like it's a precursor to a lot of the ones that followed it. Like it was one of those that I think kicked off a trend in a really interesting way. Just having the characters wake up, not know where they are, be very disoriented, and then suddenly it's just survival from that point on. It's like a deadly escape room, except back then we didn't really have the concept of escape rooms in the way we do now. So yeah, Cube is a really fun one. There are a few that like remind me of that one. Circle is like that, where people find themselves just like standing around basically in a circle and they have to eliminate a person each like round of the game. until there's one person left standing. And so that's kind of like a fight to the death. And there's actually an escape room series of movies, which I don't remember being great, but they exist. They are a thing. So that's out there. But okay, some of my favorites. I will say too. I think Circle, not Circle. I think Cube. Oh my gosh, I'm getting my shapes mixed up. I think Cube also sets up the Saw franchise ones because that one's very much like a people wake up and they're in a deadly situation and they're trying to survive. And even though it's a little bit different because Jigsaw has a whole backstory about why he's doing it, I think that definitely, I don't know if we could have had Saw without Cube. But some of my favorites that are standouts, Ready or Not, that's always going to be a favorite of mine. It's the one with Samara Weaving where she plays a bride who is marrying into this very wealthy family. Again, you have like that the have and have nots in this one too. It's because she comes from a poor background. She's an orphan, she doesn't have a family, and now she's marrying into this like very wealthy family. So she feels very uneasy around a lot of her new wealthy relatives. And um, they tell her that one of their traditions is that every time somebody gets married, they initiate the new uh, family member in by playing a game. And they basically have this system where they choose a different game to play, and the game that she gets is hide and seek. And she's kind of like, are you serious, we're really going to play hide and seek? And they're like, yeah. And so they start playing it, and I think she just thinks it's like, oh, this is just like a weird quirky thing this family does. And so she plays along with it, but she finds out that the purpose of the game is this family is now going to like hunt her down and until they kill her. So she has to hide, and if she's found, they're going to kill her. So that's basically the plot of the movie, but it's really fun. um I really like the way they make the family she marries into, they're just like delightfully awful. And she's an amazing character, she's an amazing you know um heroine, I guess you would say. I really like that. Another one that stood out to me was Bodies, 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 which is definitely a little bit different because the game that they're playing is Bodies. That game where like one person is the killer and you have to figure out who in the group is the killer. So it's like this like party game that they're playing, except people start dying while they're there. They're all locked in this house because a hurricane is coming through. So they're all throwing a hurricane party, which um having lived on the Gulf Coast for a long time, I can tell you hurricane parties are a very real thing. Matt, I know you know that too. um but yeah, hurricane parties are very real, and this is essentially what this is. And so they're all around playing this game Bodies, except it starts happening for real. And it's a fun one to watch. And then I will just go ahead and throw Squid Game out there too. It's a TV show, so it's a little bit differently. I couldn't really think of too many that were TV shows that fit into this genre. A lot of them are movies, which kind of makes sense because a game is so contained. But yeah, Squid Game for sure too. People joining in a game trying to win money but not realizing what they've gotten themselves into until they're already kind of trapped in it. So that is a standout for me.
Well, I guess the last question for us to address would be, which ones do you think that you could survive? I'm gonna go out on a limb here and say I would probably not survive most of these. Quite frankly, I am middle aged, I am out of shape, and but I am cunning. So I guess there's that. But are there any in particular that you think that you would actually like excel at and maybe possibly win or survive?
Okay, so this is kind of funny. I number one, I think you're selling yourself short, Matt. Like you are extremely smart. And if it was any kind of like battle of the wits or find a way to outsmart people, I think you would do very well. Um for me, definitely, I don't know. I think my anxiety would get to me too much to do something like that was a puzzle, where I had to like puzzle through something. Because the minute I realized that like death was on the line, I just know myself. I think I would freak out too much to like be able to turn on my brain. I will tell you, listeners, I love puzzles. I'm one of these people who spends a lot of time on the New York Times Games app. I love to do that sort of thing. But if a gun was being held to my head, I don't think I could do it because I think I would just be too scared. But I am freakishly good at hide and seek, even as an adult. I have kids, I have nieces and nephews, and even now they like to sometimes play hide and go seek with me. And I'm very good at finding good places to hide, but also folding myself up into like tiny spaces and being very quiet. So if somebody was, I don't know, I kind of feel maybe that's why I like Ready or Not, but I kind of feel like if there was anything I was going to have even like a half a chance at, I feel like it might be hide and seek. So, yeah, there you go. All right. Well, on that note, I think that is what we've got for at least what is our introductory episode for our fun and games series. I'm really excited about this one. I'm excited to talk about some of the different movies and horror stories that kind of fit in this genre and pulling them apart and picking them apart. But you know what? We would love to hear from you guys. If there is something you would like us to cover, let us know. Or if perhaps you think you might survive a particular game to the death, let us know that too. We are across social media. We are at No Fear Cast on Twitter and or X, whatever they're calling it now, and Instagram. We also have a Facebook page. Our email is nofearcast@gmail.com. If you love what we're doing, consider supporting us on Patreon. We also have merchandise available at our website, nofearcast.com. Of course, you can simply rate and review us, which is entirely free for you, but it does help other listeners find us. The music is by Nicholas Gasparini. We will be back in 2 weeks with a brand new episode.